I'll say a hello. My name is Meghan Fay Zahniser. I'm the Executive Director of AASHE. For those of you that don't know AASHE, we are the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education, serving anyone in higher education working on sustainability, primarily in North America, but we do have folks throughout the globe. And happy to be here with my friends and colleagues today, Jane Davidson and Leith Sharp. And we're going to be talking about how we protect the well-being of future generations and put hope into action, something that especially these days feels more important than ever before. So let me just check in. Hello, good morning. Jane and Leith, we're trying to have a very informal discussion today and celebrate the launch of Jane's book, Future Gen, Lessons from a Small Country. But let's just do a quick round of intros. Jane, if you wanted to share a little bit with the community, who you are and what you're doing.
Okay, well, hi, I'm Jane Davidson, and I am delighted to be the author of Future Gen, and a huge thanks to Chelsea Green for publishing the book. And I was a minister in Wales for 12 years. And after that, I spent nearly a decade in a university leading on sustainability. And I think my passion is about how we look after the interests of future generations, and whether that's through law, as we've done in Wales, or whether that's how you take an institution forward in a very purposeful way, whether that's at state level, whether that's at town level, whether that's at city level, like the climate cities. You know, how can we be better looking after the interests of future generations?
You're awesome, Jane. Thanks for being here. Leith.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm sitting here in the deep dark evening of Sydney in Australia, where I am participating in lockdown near my family. And I run Harvard's Executive Education for Sustainability Leadership program out of the Harvard C.H. Chan School of Public Health. And I've been engaged in sustainability leadership for a couple of decades now. And I'm particularly interested in finding those case stories and case studies around the world that really illustrate pathways to achieve deep transformational and evolutionary progress around these very complex problems that are amassing around us as we speak.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm so happy to have this morning. For me, it's morning for me, afternoon for Jane, nighttime for Leith. So again, thanks to Chelsea Green Publishing for organizing and hosting this session today that really is engaging throughout the world. And I think just a couple of logistical points to our folks listening in and joining for this morning. We're going to do Q&A toward the end. So Leith and Jane and I are going to have a conversation, again, sort of thinking about protecting future generations and how we can give them hope. Hearing these lessons from a small country in this amazing book that Jane has written, and then love to hear your thoughts. So I'll be checking in. There's a Q&A function here via Zoom, so please do feel free to enter in your questions, and we'll do the best that we can toward the end, about quarter of, to address all the questions that come in. But perhaps first we should start. I want the folks to know how we know each other. And Leith, you just sort of spoke to your work, but it was 2015, I think, Jane, you said, that we all met at Leith's Harvard Exec Ed program. Is that right? That's right.
Yeah, I think so. I know that I came to a Harvard Exec program as a participant, and I had such fun at it. And then Leith asked me back to be faculty in 2017. And I think that's when we all met, and we did a fair bit of work together during the program. And it's such a good program because it takes people from all over the world, from all sorts of different disciplines. And Leith doesn't let up, does she, Meghan? She really does work in that time.
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing. And Leith, you've been able to engage, leaders from all different sectors from all around the world. And Jane, when you were participating, the ACT was like, you were sort of toward the end of your journey with not just the ACT, but even sort of not yet on the journey to write the book. So I guess I'm curious, Jane, if you could maybe speak to some of the pieces that led to, ultimately, again, what we're talking about today is protecting the future well-being of future generations. So if you can start with sort of sharing, your thought process that led to this landmark and revolutionary act in Wales. Like, what was sort of the paradigm shift that sort of brought you to that moment?
I think the paradigm shift was actually what we call civil society in the UK. I mean, those are the activists, those are the people in communities, those are the parents, those are the young people who want to see change. And way back in 1998, which was when the legislation, the founding legislation for the Government of Wales Act was first created, it was civil society that called upon the parliamentarians in the UK government to put in to that act a duty to promote sustainable development in everything the new National Assembly did. So when I came in as a new Assembly member in 1999, that duty was in place, and that duty was unique. It was unique in the UK, but what I didn't realise at the time, it was almost unique in the world, that duty to promote. And I suppose my journey as somebody who was first Minister for Education and then Minister for Environment, Sustainability and Housing in that National Assembly for Wales was about how to make that duty work. And one of the things that became quite clear over the years that we tried to do that is that actually a duty to promote isn't enough. It's not enough because it doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't agree on a definition of sustainable development. It doesn't help people on the journey other than in the most vague terms. And it's that led to the Labour Party, the party that was in government, deciding that they were going to have what is now the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And so my parting shot as a politician in 2011, when I left politics and moved into the university sector, was to lay out what I felt was absolutely necessary in such a piece of legislation. And I'm delighted that that then got taken into law.
I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And I know we have all been doing collectively sustainability work many, many years, a long time. I don't know that I can think of anything on par with this, Jane. The idea that Wales has put this into legislation to basically have the protection of future generations be the role of government. I mean, it's incredibly inspiring. Leith, I'm wondering, based on, again, your work with so many different folks, not just in higher education, but other sectors, can you think of other examples sort of that are, I don't know, perhaps that maybe even inspired some of this work that that Jane has come to lay out here in this book?
Well, I think Jane's core inspiration, as I understand it, is an alignment with like lifelong values that she's held, and that has then attracted her to other people that resonate with those intrinsic values to create the conditions in each sector that are conducive to life on Earth. And actually one of the things about Jane is she's had a professional life that spans most sectors that are probably on the call today. And those values, Jane, you've carried them wherever you've toiled as a change agent, whichever sector. The same values have functioned as your true north. What was different, in my understanding in this case, was having access to the apparatus of government and putting it to work to really apply the capacity of government in a really healthy way to enact legislation that would then provide the right guardrails and incentives for people to come together and do good work. And this is very, like, right now as we're all grappling with this pandemic, and we're getting to see really clearly the different ways that governments in different countries are responding and the impact that then has on the people. And in a way, I think the pandemic is an illustration of the health of government in every country right now. And the cost, the human cost, we're getting to count in numbers by the day. And in a way, I think that's it's a microcosm of the spectrum that we're facing right now in the degrees to which governments across the world are showing functional response to our larger imperatives to preserve life on Earth. And that what we have to do is find those governments out there that are illustrating the healthiest possible reflexes, and to platform them and to learn how did the humans inside those stories bring that to be, because it's not magic. And this is what's important about the book. When you read it, it's told through a voice of just sheer honesty, about the degree of there's messiness involved. It's a very human process. It's you kind of muddling until you make it. It's not that Wales was this shiny, brilliant, magical place that just pulls great legislation out of its bum when it wants to. It's hard work, and it takes people on the ground with tenacity and character and that core intrinsic passion to keep moving it through. So this is a tale that I think is so important for us to platform, because when you look to how nature does evolution, it's by some adaptation happening somewhere that was then replicated successfully and grew out. And this is, we in the sustainability space, we've all got to be paying attention to where are those case stories sprouting that we should be really noticing and looking to understand enough to replicate in our own way, in our own context.
Leith, so many important points there. And just to really uplift a couple of things that I heard. I mean, number one, speaking to perhaps not just what inspires you, Leith, but also Jane, sort of our deep connection to nature. And Jane, I was thrilled to be reading about your childhood in Zimbabwe at the beginning of the book, which was news to me. But also, Leith, what I just heard from you, sort of like the fact that this isn't magic, that Jane, perhaps I've never been to Wales, I cannot wait to come visit, but the fact that it's not just sort of this highly evolved country that is like, no, we all just get it here and it's perfect. No, the reality is, I mean, your dependency on coal was not too long in the past, right? So the fact that this is truly remarkable legislation and sort of a tremendous, really milestone for the world, I think is something that not just governments can learn from one another, but higher education institutions, companies, like how can we really learn from the experience of Wales? And Leith, you're very, a lot of people that have worked and known you for a while, we know about the squiggle. And what the squiggle means is represents it's from point A to point B, or success. It's not a straight line. So Jane, if you could speak to recognizing that there were likely, and you describe it in the book, and I'm so sorry, I keep like moving my computer by referencing your book. If you could describe, Jane, some of those perhaps highs and lows, because I think, again, for sustainability change agents especially, it's important to hear about the missteps, the misfires, those things that don't go well. And then, Jane, you could talk consistently in the book about perseverance. So if you could highlight a few of those pieces for our listeners, I think that'd be helpful.
No, thank you. I think, I absolutely love Wales. I love living here. It's a very green country. 88%, I think, of the land is agricultural. But I think that there'll be plenty of people in Wales who say this work is only just beginning. This is a long journey, and I think there's the squiggle. Calling it the Harvard squiggle, I think, gives it kudos. But essentially, it's that thing for all of us where, we describe achieving something as though we've moved from A to B in a straight line. But in fact, right from the very beginning, this didn't get off to a good start, because when the National Assembly started in Wales, there was so much for the new institution to do. And although, I was part of the government that promoted the idea that actually all the ideas that are there in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act now, there was no political space to do anything with that. I mean, there was an institution that had never been an institution. The civil service had to get used to the idea of having assembly members to work with. The assembly members had to get used to the idea of being policy makers. There were very few powers in Wales at the time, whereas now it's a full parliament. And it's, you know, so we were really ambitious at the beginning, but ambitious on paper. And in fact, you know, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that in the first 10 years of the Assembly, that a lot of people thought that we'd failed in this duty. We'd failed in the duty because we hadn't found the mechanism to institutionalize it in the business of government. And it's exactly the same issue, whether or not you're a business, whether or not you're a university or a college or anything else, is what is the mechanism to institutionalize what you want to achieve? Because if you don't have that, you don't have a means of achieving the values you're promoting. So we had the values, but no mechanism. And I think that the really clever thing about the Future Generations Act now, and I mean, although it was passed in 2015, it didn't become a law till 2016. People had a couple of years to prepare their first plans, all those sorts of things, which means that really we're only in the first year or so of operation now. And this is really early on in the life of the Act. But the Act does two incredible things, I think, in my view. And these are the things that I have to say, these are not things that I particularly proposed. I think that it's the Parliament that actually put this together with those civil society activists. And the two incredible things the Act does is, one is it mandates ways of working. And that is so important. It mandates that you have to think long term. You have to think preventatively. You have to integrate your ideas with others. You have to collaborate with others. And probably in many ways, most importantly, you have to involve the people about whom decisions are being made in those decisions. So that fundamentally moves away from the short-term politics that we see on a daily basis, and which is kind of like out of control, I think, across the world at the moment, because we've got so many big, wicked issues, and short-term politics doesn't work. It just literally puts plasters on all the way through. And the second thing it does is it lays out 7 goals that define, they're in law, they define what activities are appropriate. And Leith was talking about, you know, COVID and the responses of countries. Well, on mainland UK, Wales has the best outcomes in COVID. And it has the best outcomes in COVID because we locked down longer and the government took a public health approach. Now, there's lots of queries here. Should we have locked down earlier, before the UK government, et cetera, et cetera? But I think it's, you know, that point about that there are nations in the world that take a people focus, and that people focus leads you in a different direction. And that's very much about, you know, how we're going to look after future generations has to be about that human face. But I think the most exciting thing in the Act, and I wish I'd thought of this, so I pay huge tribute to all those people who contributed to this. The Act redefines prosperity. It defines prosperity as low or zero carbon. It is innovative. It creates opportunities for decent work, and it operates within environmental limits. Now, Wales is not only the only country in the world that has a law like this, despite 193 UN member states signing up to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also Wales has defined low carbon prosperity into law. And this from the country that was right in the furnace of the Industrial Revolution, the country with the first £1 million cheque anywhere on the planet was ever signed. So it's an extraordinary ambition. And I hope that one of the things around the publication of the book will be that there's 140 people who are contributing to this story. And they're contributing not just about Wales, but about opportunities for any business, for any country, for any university or college to sort of pick up this idea and run with it. Because this is about personal commitments to future generations.
Jane, what I've heard, actually both you and Leith really speak to is really our current moment, right? So the journey you just described, absolutely incredible. and where we are right now, full on crisis. And Leith, you spoke to how different countries managing differently. Jane, the fact that Wales has centered people and care for its people, prosperity, is incredibly encouraging coming from someone who's in the United States right now. And I think yesterday I heard a stat that there's a person dying every minute from COVID. So that's the reality, that COVID is impacting individuals, whether it's directly, indirectly, in some way, shape, or form. And there's a graphic that I've seen, I think from the Climate Justice Alliance, that shows like these different waves, right? Ocean waves. And the smallest is COVID. Then there's this big economic wave. Then there's the climate crisis. And especially in light of the national, but frankly, I think it's really a global dialogue on injustice, and particularly racial injustice. Hearing you, Jane, speak to centering people, and one of the pieces I greatly appreciated was your reference of the Brundtland Commission definition of sustainable development, and your need in the book to say, no, we need to have consistency with what we're actually talking about when we say sustainability. And what I'm hearing, and we within the AASHE community, we still have a lot of well-intentioned folks that are like, oh, the sustainability folks, wastewater and energy, cool. We're like, that's not, I mean, this is where the sustainable development goals, I think, have really helped to spread and help inform and grow the understanding of the breadth and depth of sustainability. And I wonder if perhaps both of you could speak to, especially given this moment right now, where we know campuses are in crisis. In the States, campuses that had planned, one thing last week now are changing because of all of the, basically the numbers keep increasing. So I'm wondering what guidance you might share, each of you, given that so many sustainability plans are sort of on hold because there's basically other crises at the moment. And again, with this, my perspective is this fundamental interconnectedness of social equity and racial justice and justice in general with sustainability. I'm just curious what you might share with our listeners this morning. And who wants to go first, Leith or Jane?
Leith.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, Megan, is it an exploration around, because we're dealing with this coming at us from so many different facets, basically it's a multi-topic crisis ranging from tipping points of inequality and injustice leading to social unrest, particularly in the US, but in many countries now,
Totally.
the economic stress and strain and the extraordinary breaking point that many people are at in terms of basic economic security, and the human health crisis that's all around us, and then the looming and currently also experienced crisis of climate change with extreme weather events, which now, if you're ever watching a decent production of global news, that pretty much covers the key topics that we're hearing every night. And this is where this case story for me has extraordinary importance, because when you look at the way that the good people that worked on this, as Jane's pointed out, this was an effort of many hands, and this was an effort of civil society interacting effectively to influence government, influence those politicians and parliamentarians, and keep on them and keep coming back with deeper and deeper commitment pushes. The 7 goals, in a way, wrap up all of the bad news that we hear every night on the TV. These goals encompass all of those and frame out a long-term commitment for government to nurture and nourish a fabric of society, culturally, infrastructurally, economically, that presupposes that these are going to continue to come at us, and that the role of government is meant to help all sectors come together and tend to a very different era than what we've come from, or what we've been aware of. And in that era, fundamentally, is a reality that perhaps we only temporarily forgot, which is this world is a world of constant dynamic change and high degrees of uncertainty. And perhaps we're just being broken out of a temporary cultural illusion that has held us in a state of expecting that things are going to stay the same for long enough for us to build systems and structures that assume high levels of control and assume that we can run them with well-oiled hierarchical control structures, when all along nature and evolutionary processes tell us, and indigenous cultures tell us over and over again, that life is really much more of a dance with uncertainty and emergent phenomena. And what we have to be really coding our culture around and our society is around a readiness for constant upheaval and change. And this is now us playing catch up back to that reality. And these goals, you'll see one of the goals is a resilient whale. So they're even, you know, they're coding in that radical upheaval is going to be normal in the world going forward. And they're coding that in alongside a more equal whales, a healthier whales, a prosperous whale. So the collective intelligence that went into this was tuned in to our global context reality and has managed to bring those signals into the heart of the government apparatus. And that's now what, you know, we're at a tipping point where we need governments all over the world. We need our citizenry all over the world. We're out on the streets today, but tomorrow we need to be right in there with the parliamentarians, influencing them to code this stuff in. Yeah. Otherwise, we're all going to starve, you know, out on the streets. Basically, it's got to become something that lives inside our best civil society institutions.
Yeah. And Leith, I really appreciate you uplifting Indigenous wisdom and knowledge. And, you know, Jane, even with growing up in the United States, the Iroquois Nation, which was a tribe of Native Americans, had as foundation to their culture this philosophy of making decisions with the consideration of 7 generations in the future. So building on Leith's points, and again, the recognition of right now the multitude of intersecting crises that we're facing. I guess, Jane, would be curious to hear your reflections on that, but also historical question on how did that, you speak to it in the book, could you share to our listeners sort of that discussion around the breadth and depth of sustainability and really the spectrum of what we're talking about when it comes to consideration of future generations? It's not just wastewater and energy.
Yeah, no, I mean, Leith referred to the goals, and I think there's probably a couple of important things to say about the Welsh goals and what we can do. I'm assuming we can, in the context of this, is when it gets shared afterwards, we can attach a link so anybody who's interested in it can just see a little bit more about the Welsh legislation. But I think the fundamental point of the goals being in the Act themselves means that they are then now enforceable in the courts. We also have a Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, a really active individual named Sophie Howe, who has an office, who is charged with the responsibility of both being a critical friend to all the public services in Wales which are subject to the legislation, but also has produced a major report just in the last few weeks, which she's required to do a year before an election to the Welsh Parliament. And that helps all the political parties decide on what they're going to do with the Act in the future. So a big testing point of this legislation will actually be what people come forward with for the elections in Wales next year. But I think, as Leith was describing, you know, you and I, Meghan, having worked in the university sector, know that most often than all, we might think about intergenerational justice and that fantastic quote from John Rawls about do unto future generations what you would have wanted past generations do unto you. But normally what happens in the university sector is it goes straight into estate management and therefore it goes straight into energy and wastewater and environment. But the Welsh goals in law, they're about prosperity. They're about resilience, that is the biodiversity message, but they're a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, that notion of identity and community, and a globally responsible Wales, a Wales that anything it does elsewhere in the world takes those same values with it. And essentially, what we're doing is talking about a value system driving a country, or a value system driving an organization. And in that sense, it is absolutely not environment, although it is also about the environment. Because, you know, you can almost say that our relationship with nature is our fundamental relationship, because without nature being in good order, humans don't survive. So that is absolutely fundamental, but it's about all aspects of what we do. And intergenerational equity, this message about future generations, is important because of that. And what I love, going back to your points about, you know, indigenous wisdom, are that, you know, we at the moment, and it's not, this is not about any individual country, but politics often changes every day at the moment. And I think what COVID has done has really shown how, you know, a decision made today is a different decision tomorrow. And we've had an exams fiasco in the UK, which some of you will have followed. And that has meant a decision taken on one day has been changed the following day. Now, that exams fiasco has been an absolute metaphor for how we're not looking after future generations, because that group of young people who are suffering through that exam system, because our system is predicated on single exams in terms of their future outcomes, along comes a great big global issue that gets in the way, and suddenly their futures are uncertain. Their immediate futures are uncertain. And yet, as you were saying, Meghan, how much more uncertain are they in the context of climate change, which is the much bigger wave coming down the line? And it's quite hard to think 7 generations. I mean, I pay absolute tribute to those indigenous cultures that can still do that, that can learn from their histories and keep that oral tradition alive. And I think one of the most important messages that I've taken from that indigenous wisdom as well is the honourable harvest. The idea that, you know, when you take your harvest, you give something back. And you don't give back nitrates, you don't give back chemicals, you don't destroy the world, because the whole point of giving back is to restore the soil, to restore nature. So I think that fundamentally for me, this is about Wales. I mean, I might have been a strong promoter of it, but it's people of all parties. It's people in communities across Wales. It's young people across Wales who signed up to the idea that actually they wanted a value system in Wales, which was inherent in thinking about who we are, what the Welsh nation looks like, what our identity is. And it's a global identity. We're people of all nations living here in Wales. And how that can be translated into policy that looks after current and future generations. And we won't tackle climate change unless we're thinking about the interests of future generations. It's the wicked problem that drops off the list if all you're thinking about is what your popularity is like as a government next week. Yeah. And the governments won't be popular very long if they're not tackling these big issues. So as Leith was saying, and it just really excited me when I thought about, you know, if people followed the Sustainable Development Goals in those 193 UN countries, they would have a value system that enabled them to deal with COVID, with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with Black Lives Matter and all the equity issues, with intergenerational justice. And what Wales has done, little old Wales, has translated that into law. And therefore it has the value system. What it is still developing is the responses to the value system, the systems that will enable it to actually have the appropriate responses, not just at government level, but all those public services that actually help all of us every day of our lives.
Absolutely. And Jane, while I definitely want to get to impact of the act, not just within Wales, but around and response from the global community, but something else you just said, I want to spend a few moments on, because I think it's so important that, Jane, you spoke about governments not just responding short-term strategies, short-term solutions, short-sightedness, really. And Leith, it's making me think of, again, your frame, a lot of the frame around how do we create systems for creativity and innovation. And as much as right now, I think the fact that the health crisis, the global health crisis, is obviously in front of us. And again, some of us, even our listeners today, may be directly impacted or indirectly impacted. But Leith, I'm curious, hearing Jane again, thinking about, number one, a values-driven government is just, it gives me chills. It's like so exciting to me because it's pretty far from where we are in the United States. But recognizing values-driven organizations is not something specific to government. Like, that is translatable to any sector. And I'm just curious, this frame of not just values-driven decision-making, but also thinking not just for short term. Leith, your thoughts, reflections on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we look at a lot of our governance and decision-making architecture that we've inherited, current generations that are alive today inherited a legacy from past generations. It's obvious, particularly when you contrast those governance and decision-making parameters that are in play, and maybe contrast them against how nature does decision-making, or how Indigenous cultures that have lasted for, in Australia, 60,000, 70,000 years, how they did decision-making. And you can start to diagnose really fundamental design problems in the decision-making architecture that our dominant cultures are running at the moment. And the issue of time is an incredibly, I guess you're nailing one of the most dire things that we have to address, which is the short-termism and the way that that's designed into many systems, ranging from the way that corporate structures design short-term profit, election cycles really pit often well-meaning politicians find themselves simply spending all their time trying to prepare for the next election instead of doing the work of serving their people. And even in universities, it's become this battle to just get some corporate funding for your research project instead of actually being able to research the thing that society needs to learn about the most. So short-termism has really crept up to literally a terminal level for our society. So now it's about looking beyond our own dominant culture to look at how other more successful, in the sense of long-lasting cultures and other long-lasting complex systems make decisions. And what are the underpinnings of that kind of decision-making architecture that allows for longevity within complexity. And we have those all around us, Janine Benyus and Dana Baumeister, who are just fabulous thought leaders in the biomimicry space, or many thought leaders now connecting Indigenous wisdom across to the Western mind so that we can finally really bridge and understand the well of wisdom that sits there in these Indigenous cultures. I think this is an extremely important time for us to be looking to these places beyond our own dominant culture to understand how our decision-making architecture can again become more in tune with a sense of time that is aligned with how life happens on Earth, and no longer held captive to our own strange cultural experiment of the last several hundred years, if not a few thousand years.
Well, picking up on that notion, Leith, of learning from different cultures, learning from different countries, Jane, I am really curious. What has been sort of the response? I mean, some might say, and even one comment that's already come in is sort of like, why aren't other countries doing this right now? You know, putting together a similar act, considering the well-being of future generations. So curious, in your experience, what has been sort of the reaction, aside from hopefully a lot of kudos, the reaction from other countries?
Well, I think there's two things. I think first of all, about a sort of reaction in Wales, because you know, I think a lot of people looked at the Act when it first sort of hit their desks as senior managers in the health services, or, you know, we're working with economy, working in nature or anything else, and thought, what does this mean to us? The key thing is it's the permission to think differently. And it means that we will, I think, see quite a change in terms of what Wales is doing in the delivery of those services. So in the context of health, there has been a massive push to kind of social and green prescribing, which is really exciting. And it was already there, but it's now becoming a major national push as opposed to anything else. People are starting to look differently about the way land should be used. One of the most exciting projects that I know about is in 3 of the old South Wales coal valleys, where, I mean, literally for the last 100 years, people have been trying to find ways of different uses of the land for those communities, particularly if they've been left behind by the nature of industry, whether it's quarrying or coal or steel or iron or copper. You know, there's so many communities in Wales that have contributed towards that in those industries. And one of the most exciting propositions is where people are going to be awarded land, their town and the land around it, in perpetuity if they deliver businesses according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And I mean, that would be transformative, and that sort of model could have huge impact in other countries in the world. I mean, Wales, along with Scotland, with Iceland, New Zealand, Canada, I think, are all members of the Wellbeing Alliance, where their governments are looking at budgeting differently according to well-being in the context. So we are seeing that old adage of, you know, never think a small group of people can't change the world. They're the only ones who can, because things have to start somewhere. And people might look at Wales and say, well, I don't want to do it like that, but I want that philosophy. Well, I think that the idea of setting goals and ways of working in legislation or in corporate mechanisms could be done anywhere. And so I hope companies pick this up. And I know that, you know, a new initiative around leaders on purpose, we've already got B Corps, for example. I mean, all these sorts of initiatives are really good. And I mean, a very kind of like just at the sort of college and university level. St. Michael's College in Vermont, the year I came to Harvard, I was invited to go and deliver the Sutherland Lecture in St. Michael's College in Vermont. And since then, there has been regular exchanges between my university, the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and St Michael's College. And those students are using the Act to decide how they'd like future to be, and coming to Wales to ask us, you know, about our thoughts, about some of their thoughts. And therefore we're having these wonderful global exchanges between our students. Now this year, we couldn't have that exchange because of COVID, but, you know, 2021, I'm going to be back in the classroom with students from Vermont, you know, talking about this, or maybe in Vermont, talking to those students about whether or not there are other universities, colleges, countries, towns picking up these sorts of ideas. Because really this is about a value system. And if we want to look after the interests of future generations, that's not our children. Because of course we wouldn't want to look after our children. And of course we want to look after their children and their children. And of course there are many adults today who are great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. But when you think that even as a grandparent, you're the child who you care about so much may live to be 100. And then you think what we're throwing down the line at them, because we're shifting the problems. We're shifting the problems of climate. We're shifting the problems of nuclear waste. You know, we're shifting the problems of coping with these huge issues onto their generation. I hope that's a real wake-up call to us all. We should be demanding of all political parties that they demonstrate they should be looking after future generations. And what those policies might look like will be very different according to where the parties come from. This is not an agenda for, you know, in the US for Democrats rather than Republicans. It's an agenda for all. It's an agenda for all parties in the UK. It's Labour, it's Conservative, it's all the nationalist parties as well. And in fact, if I just say in Wales, where when I first started this journey in Wales and introduced the idea that sustainable development should be the central organising principle of government, the single act that preceded the legislation, it was Labour in partnership with Plaid Cymru that delivered on that. So there are all sorts of partnerships possible in this world. And going back to one of Leith's points, I mean, one of the things I found so interesting in taking part in the executive education program in Harvard was, you know, what I've kind of offered is a command and control model, a government-led model. But that government-led model would not exist at all had there not been an adaptive organising mechanism underneath it. It was the people of Wales looking for more that gave that first push, that first catalyst of putting the duty to promote into our founding constitution. It was the founding fathers and mothers of the Welsh Constitution that set us on the path. And that's what we need to be thinking about, how we influence politicians, how we influence corporates.
Jane, because it had those roots in the people, self-organizing effectively enough and then interfacing with that more formalized structure of government and influencing it effectively, and then having an, you know, change agents inside like yourself elected into a ministerial role to really then take it, you know, further along again. I think that has a lot to do with, and I'm throwing this to you, when we look at those ways of working. So Meghan, your question about short-termism, I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to dismantle the grip of short-termism on the throats of all of our institutional systems and structures. And the way that this legislation actually legislates, back to Jane's point before, not only the goals, but ways of working to enact the goals. And specifically, one of the 5 ways is involvement, which is a time-bending concept, because you cannot adequately involve stakeholders without committing the time and being flexible enough about your time frame to allow those voices, those diverse voices, and the collective intelligence of the communities that are being engaged to be the source of wisdom that then, you know, feeds in and guides the how do these goals come to life in the specific community contexts. And that, I think, legislating in the way of working as including deep stakeholder involvement and engagement and collaboration, meaning you don't involve the stakeholders and then have the most powerful people do what they wanted to do all along anyway. You involve them to deliver on effective collaboration. So I think that's where this legislation is trying to break through that short-termism reflex that is still very much alive in so many of the incentives in government. And in Wales, that's, you know, you've got your election cycle, people want to be re-elected, so they're hustling for votes. So this is trying to counter some of the unhealthy short-termism in government itself. And I think there's so much for us to learn from that. And while goals might be different in every country that pursues something like this, I think things that should stay, we should think seriously about trying to translate and replicate are commitments like that, commitments to the involvement of the stakeholders, because when we look to Indigenous communities and we look to how nature does decision making, it is tapping that collective intelligence that has the sentient context awareness that allows for the optimal decisions to be made and remade and evolved over time. Over to you, Jane, to build on that.
Well,
and I will just interject 10 minutes, and I have like several more questions from the participants.
Okay, well, just a very quick point then, Megan, because I love to hear from participants. I think that one of the things I found very special about this is that those people who crafted this legislation crafted it to work with the SDGs, with the Sustainable Development Goals. And 193 countries across the world have committed to deliver on Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Wales at the moment, as far as we're aware, and we're testing, and if anybody else knows different, please let us know, is the only country, and not even a member state, that has a mechanism to do that. Therefore, there is something, I hope, about the Wales experience that can help other countries or individual organisations that want to deliver on Sustainable Development Goals. Because there's so many Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, 17 the goals themselves, but 160 odd with all the actions involved. But if you can find a narrative mechanism that means that it's easier to find your way into that. And I really pay tribute to those people who developed the legislation in Wales for doing that, because I think they've done that so that now the meaning is clear and the process is clear. And if you've got clear meaning and clear process, you can have clear action. And I think that's the offer, as it were, of the Welsh experience to the world. We probably won't be the best. I hope we're overtaken by people who do more, and therefore that will push people in Wales to do more, because that's the way progress happens.
Thanks for both of those reflections, Leith and Jane. A couple of questions from our audience here. Jane, do you think framing reducing climate change in terms of protecting future generations will be able to get more people involved?
Yeah, I think it will. And the reason I say that is, for so long in my professional life, as somebody who, is absolutely persuaded by all the evidence on climate change, but I know that it's become a political issue. And when facts become political issues, there has to be another way of addressing it. And I think in many ways, it's exactly what I did in terms of promoting what's now the ACT anyway, is you have to go around a corner and you have to find another way of describing it in a way that means something. And just as I was talking about grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents a few moments ago, no great-great-grandparent is going to want to see their great-great-grandchild damaged by climate change. But if those people don't influence governments now, that will be inevitable. So it's, all politics should be looking after future generations. And we may need to almost go back to the war principle, where all countries after the war tried to create a better opportunity for future generations and have those long-term principles.
Well, and in a time when I think perhaps everyone is looking for some hope and inspiration, I know I have been incredibly inspired by the youth activism throughout the globe. Greta Thunberg and her school strike for climate, and the students and young professionals throughout the globe that are really standing up for racial justice, for climate. I wonder if, Jane, you can speak to, given the ACT is about future generations, how are students and young professionals, if at all, involved in sort of this collective intelligence that Leith spoke about?
Well, I mean, there's, for a start, Wales has been very strong on children's and young people's rights since the beginning of the National Assembly for Wales. We had the first children's commissioner, were actually seen as a European example in terms of youth work, for example. But no, what we have now is we have structures in Wales. There is a youth parliament in Wales that influences the parliament and operates across the same kind of constituency seats. So it literally reflects at a younger level. There's a leadership academy that's run by the Future Generations Commissioner, of those young leaders out there in the public sector organisations who are informed and encouraged to lead in initiatives. There are the largest number of eco schools are in Wales, in the UK, kind of per head of population. So there's a very strong movement. And I mean, I know in our own university, the president of our students has now, on the third occasion now, gone on to become the president of the National Union of Students in Wales, and they've all been interns on my sustainability programme. So we are seeing, you know, and they've got terribly involved in initiatives, and that's true across the whole of Wales in terms of universities. So young people have been very involved in the development of the ambition, and now I think it's almost like handing over to young people in the sense of saying, this act is for you. Government needs to step back and it needs to be listening to young people in the context of what they feel is important for their futures in Wales. And they want this legislation to work, and they want it to deliver.
Absolutely. And Leith, you know, as inspiring as Jane and all of those involved in developing the Act are, you know that there's probably even a couple folks on the call today, and certainly people in our community, that are like, this is still pie in the sky. Like, as inspired as I am, I'm in a structure that where some people might not feel that they have this opportunity to really advance progressive change. Leith, what recommendations might you have for those folks feeling in that position?
Yeah. Oh, well, having engaged with thousands and thousands of change agents that toil away in every scale, from very humble scale to the, you know, the national, international scale, as Jane has here. What I have noticed is really the patterns that sit underneath the work of engaging people, activating collective human intelligence, creating conditions that bring out the best of the creativity, the best of our context awareness, and our passion and our intentions to be conducive to life on Earth. That it's the same wherever you toil, whatever scale, it's the same work. And that tipping points, you never know, like, how your contribution, whatever scale it is, how it's helping us get towards tipping points. I've heard so many absolutely mind-blowing stories of when people that you might think have massive impact footprints out there, as in they're high-powered change agents, you peel back, well, where did they start? Like, what got them going? And it'll be a humble interaction with a change agent that's working in a much smaller sphere that they connected with, and they were changed by that. And then they went on, because they had different sized levers to push, they went on to have a bigger impact. So I say, all of us to honor the scale at which we work, to feel the sacredness in the scale at which we work, because every scale in this work is sacred. It's about life, and it's about loving life and bringing that love into action, whatever sphere you're in. And there's a lot of deep transformation that's going to happen within us as individuals. It's going to change our relationships, it's going to change our organizations, and it's going to change our communities. And there's a lot about those transformations that are extremely liberating, and they're full of vibrant reunions with life force that many of us have been disconnected from. And so, as hard as it might seem, inside the work, there is a lot of regenerative energy that will flow into those engaged in the work.
Leith, that gives me hope. I hope the same for others on the call. And I know we're nearly at time, but Jane, I have to ask you, I mean, this is, again, such a huge accomplishment, not just the act, but also the book. And I think today is actually the official global launch of your book, which is awesome. So folks can get it anywhere, not just bookstores, but also available on audiobook. But Jane, if you could just speak to what gives you hope. We talked about a lot of different crises, a lot of different, a heavy burden, a lot of suffering. Still, amidst all of that, you've had such an amazing accomplishment here. What gives you hope?
I think people give me hope. I mean, I've always been an optimist, but I framed the book, as you know, through Donella Meadows' 5 tools. And you know, Donella Meadows was somebody who back in the 1970s was drawing our attention to the fact that we were overshooting the Earth's capacity, and I framed the book in her concept of, you know, visioning, networking, truth telling, you know, making sure that we're honest about the journey, learning, and I want to use Leith's word, loving, at the end, and it was Donella's word as well. And I framed the book because she is the most extraordinary woman systems thinker, an American, sadly has died now, but I mean, her work should be right to the fore in terms of the kind of discussions we're having at the moment. So I think that I'd like to finish with a quote from her, because she talks about the idea that if we think about the world as having no limits, then we extract everything we can from it. And we've seen that, particularly in terms of the fossil fuel companies. If we think the limits are real, but there's not enough time, then, you know, those people still extract, because they'll say, okay, I'll extract today, but I'll be a bit better tomorrow. And we're seeing those fossil fuel companies play that game at this moment. But she said, if you think the limits are real and close, but there is no time to waste, there is just enough energy, enough material, enough money, enough environmental resilience, and enough human virtue to bring about a planned reduction in the ecological footprint of humankind, a sustainability revolution to a much better world for the vast majority. And I think that when we think of all of us wanting to create a sustainability revolution to a much better world for the vast majority, that is a prize worth devoting our lives to. We should all be fighting for that, for our sake and for future generations' sake. That's what gives me hope, because on a call like this, I meet more people who want to do this. So the wider we can get this word out, the better. And thank you both so much for being.
Thank you. This has been so fun. And I knew that I wouldn't get to, I don't know, a dozen or so questions I had for both of you, but unfortunately we are at time. But Jane, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your wisdom. Leith, you as well. This collective intelligence here is incredibly inspiring to me. And again, thanks to Chelsea Green Publishing for creating this space today for us to hear from Leith and Jane. And again, check out this amazing book, available in bookstores, online, on Audible. Check it out. And Jane, Leith, thanks to you both.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you, Jane.
Hey, thanks so much.
Cheers, everyone.